doing some medical work, and we were working in an orphanage on a volunteer basis. And I fell in love with a little baby by the name of Fritz, and decided that Fritz actually changed my whole life's trajectory. I had been working backstage at the Fox Theater here on concert production and things like that, and thought that that's what I wanted to do. And then I decided, no, I want to go to medical school.
Wait, you were in the theater, and then you were like, I'm going to go from theater to medical school?
Yeah.
Most theater people can't go to medical school, I don't think.
I took the scenic route. I took the scenic route. So, yeah, no, it's... I worked backstage at the Fox, and then after college, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do. I went from theater to anthropology, and then went and taught English in Poland for a year after I graduated, and then came back and did pre-med part-time for 2 years, and then went to medical school at the College of Surgeons in Dublin, Ireland, and lived there.
Oh, you went to Ireland?
Yeah.
Was that because you couldn't get into American medical schools?
Well, it was a little tricky because you have to take your MCATs your junior year normally, and so I wasn't able to take my MCATs my junior year, and that was the first school I applied to, and they said yes, so I went.
I mean, if I were a young person going to medical school in Ireland, probably be pretty good gig.
It was awesome. It was a great gig, and so what was great about the medical school in Ireland was that it had a whole big, huge focus on tropical medicine. And they had a program where you could go to, it was called the Overseas Elective Scheme. And you could, the students all got together and did fundraisers, and then with supervision went to developing countries. So I went to Kenya and delivered babies in Kenya for 6 weeks.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Where in Kenya were you?
Mombasa. And so, yeah, and it was supervised by a Belgian OBGYN, which was really a fascinating experience. And I learned a tremendous amount. So I worked with a Kenyan OB and a Belgian OB who were supervising me, and then came back and was actually trying to decide whether...
What kind of diseases, like, so Mombasa, you'd be on the coast, so you probably mosquito diseases.
Malaria, yeah. Malaria. You saw a lot of other infectious things, a lot of preeclampsia, very, very sick patients. And the OB wards were nothing compared to what we're used to here in the West. So you would have 2 or 3 women to a bed laboring. And then
to a bed?
To a bed.
What do you mean?
2 women or 3 women on a bed, all in labor together. And they would then, when the one was going to deliver, the other 2 would sit on the floor. And then the delivery would happen. And then you'd wipe off the bed, and the other 2 would jump back on. And then in the recovery ward, you'd have 2 or 3 women sort of in the same bed as well with their babies.
This is like shocking to me. I mean, how do you even wrap your mind around women sharing? Is this like an old practice that we've just forgotten about, or what in the hell are you talking about?
It's a limited resource government hospital that doesn't have very much. So when we would go do C-sections, right? If you right around lunchtime, the anesthesiologist would have to start paying attention to what was going on with the oxygen, because the oxygen was getting piped up from downstairs. And if they'd go on lunch break, they'd turn the oxygen off. And so the realities of the hospital were incredible. There was a young woman who came in who was delivering twins, and she was probably about 17 at most. And I got there at about 7:30 in the morning, and she had delivered one twin with a head entrapment, and the baby was dead. And so I was, trying to find somebody to help me deliver this baby, right? And finally, one of the midwives came in and was able to help deliver the baby. And then about an hour and a half, 2 hours later, I was up in the OR with a Belgian OB and heard that there was a young woman who was hemorrhaging because she had a retained placenta, and it turned out to be her. And so we went and delivered the placenta in the OR, and then she went to the ICU, and what the ICU consisted of was your own bed. That's essentially it. But she had lost a lot of blood, and there was no blood to be had in the hospital. And so she got 1 liter of fluid and walked out of the hospital alive. Another woman came in on a Friday with an ectopic pregnancy that had ruptured, and she had O negative blood. And once again, there was no blood in the hospital. And the OB was wandering around asking people, what type blood do you have? What type blood do you have? And I have A positive. So I couldn't donate. But on Tuesday, so she went to the OR with a hemoglobin of 1. The normal is, in the 13, 14 range. She went to the OR, and they wound up taking her back to the ICU, and she got a unit of blood on Tuesday and walked out of the hospital alive, which is just incredible.
When you were thinking about being a doctor, did you know that it would be like this? I mean, the stories that you're describing are what somebody could see one of those things and have that be a permanent scarring, event in their life, and yet you put yourself in the position to see that over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. No, I was really, I really wanted to do, maternal medicine is something that's fascinating to me. And I was actually struggling with whether or not to do OBGYN or to do emergency medicine. And then I realized that the Belgian OB said to me, you should probably do emergency medicine because you can then do relief work. You don't have a clinic that you're tied to, and patients that it's much easier to get up and go if you do emergency medicine. Plus, you have a whole skill set. You're not just delivering babies and doing surgical procedures, but you're doing infections and broken bones and things like that. So you've got a broader base from which to operate. So I did emergency medicine, then I felt like a jack of all trades and a master of none, although I love emergency medicine. And so I decided to go to NYU so I did my residency at WashU for 4 years, and then did a fellowship at NYU in medical toxicology. And then came back to Washington University on the faculty and was there for 10 years. I started the Medical Toxicology Fellowship Program and was the section chief for toxicology. And during my toxicology training, I came in contact with Dan Goldstein, who worked at Monsanto. And in 2015, he sent an email to our toxicology group saying he was looking for a possible toxicologist to come work at Monsanto. And I kind of hemmed and hawed and thought, oh my gosh, I don't know about working at Monsanto. But then I started reading about golden rice. Well, actually, prior to that,
Let's stop real quick. What is toxicology? It's too much of a substance in your body that's not supposed to be there, causing problems?
Well, yeah. So toxicology is the study of poisons and overdoses and things like that. And, little doses of things tend not to bother you depending on what it is. But bigger doses tend to be more of a problem. So you think of water as being non-toxic, but you can see I've taken care of patients who drink way too much water, and then their brain swells and they can get real sick from that. Water, anything can be toxic. It depends on the dose. And we think about, relative toxicities as well. We are perfectly comfortable putting botulinum toxin, injecting it in our faces for cosmetic purposes. And it is actually the most potent toxin known to mankind. And we know that we can do that safely because we've got a regulatory apparatus around it that makes sure that we're, if you follow the label, you're not going to hurt yourself.
So I know it's the same term, right? Like Botox, botulism, but if you accidentally put that needle in too far, does somebody instantly die from that? Or is it a different type of thing?
So it's in a concentration that's so low that you're not gonna hurt them. Now, we were at the Poison Center in New York. There was a case where a alternative medicine guy who had his own clinic bought research grade botulinum toxin, and so the real potent stuff. And on the label, it said not for human use.
But a lot of things say that.
Right? And he had a Botox party where he made a 17,000-fold dosing error. And he and his girlfriend went to, they showed up in New Jersey for Thanksgiving, and another couple stayed in Florida. He had a clinic in Florida with a rapidly descending paralysis. And they both wound up in the ICU, but she wound up in the ICU with the tracheostomy and a feeding tube from November till May and could only wiggle her big toe. Yeah. So once again, the dose makes the poison, right? So that was he's in jail now, but so or he I don't know, he may be out, but he went to jail for it. And the other couple that got really really sick too. So yeah, they got to be careful with. I mean, once again, botulism is a significant disease and killed lots of people, prior to people understanding how the disease worked, right, and how that chemical works. But it has really, really, actually important medical therapeutic effects too. So not just for beauty. I mean, people use it. That's what it's most famous for. But people with cerebral palsy and lots of muscle spasticity, you can inject botulinum toxin or Botox, and it'll relax those muscles so they can move much more smoothly.
So that's I didn't realize that it was used for anything other than beauty. So cerebral palsy.
Yeah, cerebral palsy. It's useful in other diseases with muscle spasticity. Yeah.
So tell me about your coming. Dan Goldstein says, "Hey, I'm thinking about having you come to Monsanto. This is why you'd want to do it." What is the use case? Like, what's the case that a seed company would make to a doctor about this?
Yeah. So, well, it actually came back to Haiti again. So in 2010, I went to Haiti again. So 21 years after the first time around. Fritz was the first baby that I'd ever seen with malnutrition, right? And so he was kind of the motivational factor in changing that. When I went back after the earthquake, a resident and I organized the relief mission to Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. And once again, I was taking care of, pregnant people and people with infections and kids and broken bones and things like that. But I kept on seeing two things. I kept on seeing malnutrition and insect-borne illness. And I thought if you could fix those two problems, you'd actually be a very long way into helping lifting people out of poverty, right? Because food security it's the basis of civilization.
Yeah, it's so far away from people in the Western world that you don't really even know anyone that's ever really been hungry, right?
Yeah.
Like where I was in Kenya, they were not hungry at that moment, but you could talk with them about times when they would only have one meal for a month, and that would be all the food that they would get. And that's like so hard for us to wrap our minds around in the age of acceleration.
That's exactly right. And so I started reading about golden rice. Well, so the interesting thing is that, with malnutrition, there are three grasses that feed over 60% of the world's population, and they're corn, wheat, and rice. And while they're good because they really fill you up, they aren't great in their micronutrient capacity. So one of the leading causes of blindness worldwide in kids is vitamin A deficiency, and it tends to happen a lot in Southeast Asia. If you could go around, if you had enough doctors or nurses to go around and drop a little drop of vitamin A under these kids' tongues, that would completely prevent it. But you don't have that kind of workforce or capacity to do that. So I started reading about golden rice, and golden rice is genetically modified to make the precursor of vitamin A, and was developed in order to address this problem. And genetically modifying different crops could actually help with micronutrient deficiencies, help prevent diseases in plants and things like that, and actually make the food supply a lot more stable. So I got interested in that. And then also, people have this concern about pesticides because there are these allegations that pesticides are associated with autism and ADHD and a variety of other things. But pesticides are really critical for public health, and people forget that. People, once again, in the West, haven't seen the plague, haven't seen typhus, haven't seen diseases of the Middle Ages since the 20th century. And the reason why is because you have these unbelievable chemistries that, once again, safe if you use them according to the label, just like Botox, right? According to the label, you really control and prevent diseases that we haven't seen for 100 years now, or getting to 100 years now. But, for example, pyrethrum. Pyrethrum is a natural insecticide that's made by chrysanthemums, and people have known for centuries that chrysanthemums had insecticidal properties. A certain kind of chrysanthemum, it's called cineifolium. And so, in the military, one of the leading causes of death is actually insect-borne illness rather than war wounds. And so, for example, in 1812, when Napoleon went and invaded Russia, he went in with over 400,000 men and came out with less than 4,000. And the conventional wisdom is that he invaded Russia too late and the winter caught up with them, right? Well, they were doing an excavation in Lithuania about 15 years ago and came across a mass grave of his soldiers' bodies. And when they exhumed the bodies and examined them, they realized that there had been a huge typhus outbreak in the ranks. And, he had invaded Russia in June. So it's probably actually insect-borne illness that was really, really the culprit for that. So at the dawn of World War II, there was a mad dash to find, there was a shortage of pyrethroids. So people finally figured out that pyrethrum was the chemistry and then made it a little bit more stable and did a synthetic version.
Well, because I believe those chrysanthemums that you're talking about, they really only grow in like West Africa or something, right?
So
they're very, very rare.
So you could actually, I think Kenya actually produces them.
Okay.
Right. And I think I'd have to double check this, but I think Kenya actually, Japan had a bunch of too.
Okay, that's fair. I just remember hearing that it was like very rare, and if you were going to try and do the pesticide control using chrysanthemums,
you needed a
lot, and so you were growing a lot of chrysanthemums in order to be able to have this molecule that also wasn't shelf stable, couldn't last for a super long time, and so then they made a synthetic version.
Version, which was a little bit more stable, and very much the same kind of chemistry properties and things like that. What it does is it blocks or it activates, turns off the gating mechanism for sodium channels in the nerves of insects, and we don't have those same kind of sodium channels, so it doesn't bother us. So anyway, long and short is there was a shortage of pyrethroids at the dawn of World War II, and therefore a mad dash to find a chemistry that was going to be very low toxicity for people and animals, but really important for insect control, because once again, typhus was a leading cause of death during World War II. And
how is typhus spread?
Typhus is spread through lice. Body lice carry typhus, and it's a terrible, horrible.
What does it do to you? I mean, this is you only see it on the Oregon Trail, right? Yeah. My only experience with it is
high fevers, rashes, just really incapacitating, and then in sepsis and death. There are two types of typhus. One is carried by mice, and it's transmitted from to fleas, and then that's called murine typhus. And there's actually an outbreak of murine typhus in California right now. It's because these people are concerned about the role of pesticides. So, with rodent control, all you need is some vitamin D. The same vitamin D that you make in your skin when the sun hits your skin is actually useful in killing rats and mice. So to control typhus, all you need is some synthetic chrysanthemum dust to kill the fleas and some vitamin D to kill the rats. But people have so much worry about the other effects of pesticides that they don't understand that banning them.
So wait, when you say vitamin D kills rodents, what do you mean? Like they get hit with sunshine, they're like vampires and get wiped out? Or you're saying vitamin D is in like we go around and inject them, or they eat it?
No, if they eat it. If they eat it, they wind up with hypercalcemia. Yeah, and they die.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I think of rat poisoning as being like extremely toxic. This is not, are we talking about different things then?
We're talking about different things. So in the past, there's been, there have been very high toxicity chemistries used for pest control. So, for example, in crops for agriculture, they used to use nicotine, and then for ant control and things like that, they would use arsenic and mercurials. And so, if kids got into that kind of stuff, they'd get really sick and die. Right, strychnine, things like that, very, very toxic things. And so as things have evolved, chemistries have evolved, they've had a much lower toxicity for people and animals, and have become increasingly more targeted for different species. So, back to the whole pyrethroid shortage. a guy by the name of Paul Mueller, a Swiss chemist, discovered DDT. And DDT revolutionized public health. So you could spray it on people and it wouldn't hurt them. They're actual. I actually heard a story yesterday that was fascinating. This woman that I had lunch with, her mother was in Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan had been devastated. And there was a big infestation of bugs and lice and fleas and all of that stuff. And so when the DDT trucks would go by, kids and adults would actually come out to run behind the DDT trucks so they could get deloused and things like that. That's how bad that was.
I had heard that people had run behind those things, but I didn't recognize that they were doing it not because it was like, oh, the sprinkler is here, but rather it's because we have lice and we want to. This will help us.
At least this was this woman's story in Japan. Yeah, right after the war, because they didn't have access to, chemistries and things like that. It was devastated. So that was one of the major ways that they.
You're saying something kind of mind-blowing here, because even though I had heard, hey, DDT got kind of a rough rap, but maybe not the fair rap, I've never heard anybody say, well, DDT is actually safe for humans. You can spray it on them, and the pathways that would, kill the insects aren't in the...
It's a different thing. Yes, exactly. And so, as a matter of fact, DDT is the reason why we don't have malaria here in the United States or in Europe, because there was a swamp draining program and then DDT spraying. And then so Paul Mueller actually won a Nobel Prize for discovering DDT in 1948. And in 1953, the National Academy of Sciences credited DDT with averting 500 million insect-borne deaths worldwide and 1 billion insect-borne illnesses. So it revolutionized public health. But the problem with DDT, just like a broad spectrum antibiotic, you kill all sorts of things, right? So you kill beneficial bugs as well as pests, right? So what happened with DDT was really when it got used in agriculture. Agriculture actually really was important for food security. For the first time ever, farmers had a very low toxicity chemical that could kill locusts. And I don't know if you're aware of what's going on in East Africa right now with the desert locust outbreak, but the desert locust is the most voracious predator of crops worldwide. A small swarm of them can eat in a day what will feed 35,000 people for a year. And this swarm has gone from Kenya over Saudi Arabia up into Pakistan and India and has spread all over the place. And it's been very, very devastating. So pesticides they have 5 crop dusters in Kenya. And so the pesticides are really important for controlling these kinds of outbreaks. Otherwise, your food supply is gone and instantly. And if you've got, people think, oh, well, what about, you've got livestock. Well, what are you going to feed the livestock, right? So you've got your food supply is wiped out at the drop of a hat with this kind of outbreak. So for the first time ever, farmers had a way of controlling locusts and other things like fall armyworm and big, huge pests. And so DDT revolutionized food security as well. But Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring and launched the environmental movement, very rightly pointed out that it had lots of off-target effects and was harming beneficial insects and harming birds of prey that would eat those beneficial insects and things like that. And so she wrote Silent Spring.
And her case was that you'd have these insects that were exposed to this disease, the birds were eating them, and then as it moved up the food chain, so maybe the fish were eating them, and then they were eating so many that they were bioaccumulating, so that by the time the dose got to the birds, because the birds, the eagles, birds of prey, weren't eating insects, they were eating fish, but those fish were eating the insects, and by the time you had concentrated it, then it was having deleterious effects on their eggs and things like that.
A variety of things like that, and a variety of sort of allegations came out of that along those lines. So, but Rachel Carson did recognize how important food security was, and she made a recommendation in Silent Spring. She realized that farmers needed something, and so she recommended that farmers use a totally natural chemical made by a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, and sprayed that on their crops because it was much more specific for crop pests. It didn't tend to bother pollinators and other things, and it didn't bioaccumulate or anything. So to this day, organic farmers spray that chemistry on their crops. Where companies like Monsanto and Syngenta and other companies got so smart was they discovered the gene in the bacterium that makes that chemical, that protein, and put it in the plant.
Yeah, we had Dr. Fred Perlak on, and we talked all about that. That's one of the early episodes. And BT is one of those things that once people hear that the organic farmers use it, they're like, oh, okay, that's fine, right? Like it's like it's one of those things that it's so ubiquitously used that once they figured out, wait a second, if we can take it from being the powder form that we go put on crops, and we instead have the plant produce it itself, so that way when the thrips bite into the leaf, then when they do that, it perforates their stomach, the insect dies, and you don't have anywhere near the need to go out and keep spraying over and over again.
You don't need DDT?
Yeah, DDT. Okay, I didn't even consider that it would wipe out the need for DDT.
Yeah, so that's what's so cool about it is it really, really decreases your need for insecticides, which is totally cool. The other thing about BT and a lot of these chemistries just in general is they are based on nature. Even the synthetic ones are a lot of the ideas about developing them come from nature. So if you think about it, BT is a protein that's made by a bacterium. Well, antibiotics are often proteins that are made by, or not necessarily proteins, but chemistries that are made by bacteria. So, for example, I think it's streptomycin. I'm trying to remember which one. Ivermectin actually was discovered.
You're going to get us in trouble on YouTube. Ivermectin is a dirty word.
It is. So ivermectin comes from a family of ivermectins that's produced by a bacterium that was found on a golf course in Japan. So organisms, plants, bacteria, things like that, they make their own chemicals to defend themselves from other organisms. So remember, plants can't run away from you. So they actually make their own pesticides. So for example, pyrethrum is made by chrysanthemums to protect themselves from insects. But they make other...
Yeah, the one that surprises most people is like nicotine and caffeine are both, they're both insecticides that the plant makes in order to be able to protect itself. It just so happens that those have a stimulating effect on us. Like if you smoke them, then you get to feel a little bit happy, a little bit alert, but you don't want to take on too much. I mean, nicotine is lethal to people at relatively small doses.
At small doses, yeah. You can get into big trouble. If your kid eats a cigarette, they get in big trouble. They get very sick. But the other thing that people don't know is that some plants produce cyanide-like compounds.
Yeah, cherry pits, right?
Cherry pits and things like that. And if you think about it, plants want their babies to survive, and that pit is around their seed. And so the more the plant's stressed, the more protection it will make around itself or its baby. So cassava is another thing. Cassava produces something called linamarin, which is also a cyanide-like compound in its skin, and it protects it from rodents, right? And if people don't prepare cassava correctly, they can get terrible neurologic illness. They can get something called conzo, where they get paralyzed from the waist down, and it's spastic paraparesis.
This makes so much sense. So when I was in the Peace Corps, it was possible that some people would move into regions where there was cassava. Where I was, it wasn't that big of a deal, but and they would say you're not allowed to prepare it for yourself. You have to have somebody else prepare it for you because they know how and you don't. Is it as simple as just peeling it or boiling it?
No, they have to peel it, and they need to activate the enzyme by crushing it, and then they need to boil it, and it's a whole big, huge deal. And if they get it improperly prepared, you get a devastating neurologic outcome, and sometimes death. It's sometimes cyanide poisoning, even if you prepare it wrong. So there are a variety of different things, but people are unaware that plants make these pesticides to protect themselves. And 99% of the pesticides we eat are chemicals that plants made to protect themselves. And they're found in much higher doses or much higher concentrations in the plant itself than any synthetic pesticide residue that you would find that people create to protect their crops and things like that. So, yeah.
So you came to Monsanto thinking, I'm going to get a chance to work on food security, and then came there, and now you're reading reports or working with the government, or what do you do?
So I do a little bit of, I'm on the regulatory scientific affairs team. And so I do some regulatory work, I do some product safety work, and then I do a lot of outreach to help people understand what the benefits and safety of modern agriculture is. I think that most people have this notion that farmers, most, I think, physicians often have this idea that farmers are really not sure of what they're doing, and they are making sort of these big pronouncements for how farming should be done. And I think that what they don't understand is that farmers are real professionals that have an unbelievable wealth of experience at feeding the world's population. Never before in the history of mankind has 2% of the U.S. population been able to feed all of the rest of us and then export 23% of what we make. That is an achievement that has never happened before, right? And when I'm hearing physicians and public health people make the claim that modern agriculture is the reason why we have autism or obesity or diabetes or all of these non-communicable diseases, heart disease, cancer, that kind of stuff, I think that I think the people who are calling for big changes are largely meanwhile. They think that they know what they're talking about, but they don't. It would be like the Lancet publishes all of this stuff about, the great food transformation and how we should ban pesticides and we don't like GMOs and we should go do agroecology and all of this stuff. I can't imagine how a group of physicians would react if farmers went to the Farmer's Almanac, for example, and said, well, antihypertensive medicines have side effects. And so we think antihypertensive medicines, because they don't make us feel good, should be banned. Well, that's not.
I mean, I think that one of the reasons, and it was hard for me to see when I was inside of the corporation, like when I was working for Monsanto, the motivations of the people on the outside, because I would look at them and be like, what you're doing appears to be evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're telling everyone don't use genetically engineered crops, or these pesticides that are produced aren't safe, when all of the evidence says it, I really had a very firm idea that they were evil. I'm coming to the conclusion that I think many of our problems in the country right now is a massive lack of meaning. And I think that people are trying to find causes bigger than themselves that they're able to latch onto. And in any type of group that you're going to join, if the group is going to have any sort of longevity, you have to give things up. Every single religion you would look at that has staying power, every cult that ever got to some strength, they had purity rituals.
That's exactly
and those
right.
purity rituals, whether or not the rest of the world understands why they're doing it, or even if their reasoning isn't correct, it's that it allows you to have an in-group and an out-group. And I think this would be happening at any time in history, no matter what, even though all of the good that's coming with it, it's because people have to make sacrifices in order to have an in-group and an out-group.
That's exactly right. I think that that's exactly right. The problem with this, though, is that if you think about it, agriculture is the foundation of civilization. So when some guy or girl 10,000 years ago planted a thatch of wheat in the Mesopotamian river basin, they liberated people from a hunting-gathering, scraping by society to being able to build cities and libraries and things that you and I can sit here and have this conversation because we're fed, right? And the scientific, so we have 10,000 years of organic farming under our belts experience and 50 years of food security in the West. And that is because of scientific advances that are so significant in agriculture. But people aren't aware of those scientific advances in agriculture.
But I think it is actually more nuanced than this.
Mm-hmm.
And I would point to the evidence of pigs,
Mm-hmm.
right? So people don't realize that pork is the largest consumed meat in the world. 36, I think, % of all the meat eaten in the world is pork, but 2 out of the major 3 religions don't eat pork at all, right?
You're right.
And you could look at them and you could say, look how much easier it would have been if you would have had pork this whole time. You could have had meat. You could have, gotten rid of all kinds of diseases that come with, the avian, the chicken production. And yet they didn't. But I think it was a factor around this sacrifice puts us in an in-group versus an out-group. And that in-group allows us to be much stronger than we would be if we didn't have these food purity concepts.
Exactly, which brings me to Trofim Lysenko.
Okay.
So do you know who Trofim Lysenko is?
No idea.
Okay, so Trofim Lysenko was the agriculture minister under Joseph Stalin.
Ooh, whoa. Okay.
Yeah, so he was very interesting. So let's just sort of back up very, very briefly. So in 1905, there was a dress rehearsal for the Russian Revolution. There was an uprising, and it was brutally put down. But the prime minister at the time, Peter Stolypin, was wondering what was causing this, what was causing all this unrest, and realized that something needed to be done. And it had been a largely peasant uprising, and they were very upset about the fact that they were essentially doing slave labor. People who held land, they had to work on the land. They couldn't keep their own food. They had to, deliver it to other people. So Peter Stolypin did a land grant program, very much like land grant programs here, whereby they were able to get a little plot of land, and as long as they took classes and learned how to farm that land productively, the loan would be forgiven and they could have that. So at the dawn of the Russian, so that's 1906, so 12 years later, at the dawn of the Russian Revolution, that group of people who became known as the kulaks were feeding up to 50% of the Russian population in a 12-year period.
Yeah, they were good at it. They were really good at it. And they were able to sell their crops.
And so they made money. And so they were perceived by the Bolsheviks as being, bourgeoisie. And they were massacred. They were sent off to the Gulag. The name of the massacre was called the Holodomor. So it was largely happened in the Ukraine. And then huge food shortages and things like that. So that was under Lenin and the program that they had for kulaks. Stalin then comes in the early 1920s when Lenin dies, and installs a person by the name of Trofim Lysenko as his Minister of Agriculture. And Trofim Lysenko did not believe in genetics and basically falsified his findings and said that he could grow wheat under really, really extraordinary circumstances.
Take it out full screen.
And then he wound up promoting this idea that was totally non-scientific, no science to base it, and took on Nikolai Vladimov, who was the premier plant scientist of his time, who he sent to the Gulag. And Vladimov, who came up with the idea of a seed bank and genetics, died in the Gulag. 50 million Russians starved because of Lysenko's policies. And then when Mao came to power in China and adopted Lysenko's farm policies, another 50 million people died in the Great Leap Forward. So anti-science, even coming from very high people, especially if it affects agriculture, has an outsized impact on food security. And food security is a really important thing to be careful with.
I mean, I completely see what you're saying. And I remember the first time I ever heard about the kulaks, and that really woke me up. In fact, I was probably 2 years into working at Monsanto. I had heard the story of the kulaks, and the parallel that I drew was people that are saying GMOs are poison or organic farming is safe and the other ones aren't, are putting us in a really bad spot, particularly the corporations that are selling into this system. Because what they're doing is they're taking money and making it off of this fear that people have of hey, maybe our food is poisoned or it's not safe. And then what are you going to do if that fear really starts on fire?
That's
if
right.
you have somebody come to power that says this is the only way we're going to do it. And I still feel like that's a grave danger in our society. I also think the idea that scientists, I believe we run a very real risk of saying we should have all of our decisions based on science, and we start moving towards a scientism, a sort of religious movement
Correct.
that says that science can tell us more than just what is true or is not true, but it also should tell us what we ought to do about it. I think they call it Hume's guillotine, right? Where it's saying this is what the science says is safe, and so therefore we can use that to determine what we ought to do on some large scale. So I'm always like this tension I didn't used to have, and now I do, because I think we're watching what happens when science gets turned into a religion and people start fighting over ideology when one side perceives we're fighting over truth, but that's every religious fight.
That's right. And I think that scientific ideas, scientific discussions, most recently have been demonstrated to be certain ideologies. If you were on one side or the other, instead of having a reasonable scientific discussion between the people who are defending the use of one thing versus another, in COVID, for example, or people having a reasonable discussion, they got railroaded into one or the other sides, and a whole lot of mistrust built up around those sides. And depending on where you stood on hydroxychloroquine versus vaccination versus ivermectin, you're, instead of having a reasonable discussion where people come to a consensus together and build trust, you got automatically labeled as a fascist or a communist. So it's really, I think, for the public to watch this debacle happen at the scientific level is really disconcerting, and they don't know who to believe anymore.
Yeah, 100%. I remember it was a couple of years ago. I don't know if it was The Daily Show or if it was like one of these late night shows, and they did this demonstration where they said, here are 99 people in a band and one that is not in the band. He's playing off on his own. And because these 99 are so loud and they play so well together, this represents the consensus on climate change. And so you're either with the 99 band players or you're this one person over here. And that, like, it really made me angry.
Yeah.
And it really made me be like, you know what? I don't want to be on your team if the way that you're going to win this argument is by saying, look at all the people that agree with us, and whatever this one person's point is, not only are we not going to listen to it, but you should drown them out. You should literally play your music so loud that there's no chance, because it's like, what if that guy brings a good point to this discussion? What if in his disagreeability, like, he brings something up that nobody considered? Without that guy, bad things can happen.
So one of the things that I think you see with the 99 is you get into a lot of credentialism, from Ivy League schools and things like that. I like to point out that Harvard, it's a great school, led the charge, though, for lobotomy in the 50s.
Did they really?
Yes, they did. So yeah, there was the dream team saying this is the way, Walter Freeman, Harvey Cushing, all these people saying that this is the absolute way to manage, psychiatric illness. And that's why, Rose Kennedy got lobotomized and devastated. Frances Farmer, who is a Hollywood starlet, got lobotomized, wrecked. So very well-heeled, credentialed people often make large recommendations, sweeping recommendations that are then taken to be the gospel truth because of their credentials. And in retrospect, you're like, whoa. So
it's a weird thing, right? Like, I don't really understand why people started moving towards the we should only have one side of the discussion, the other side is completely wrong. And I have to wonder, is this like the natural state of human beings, and that like the concept of free speech being like a social technology that we discovered, but it would entirely be possible that we could lose that social technology?
Yeah, that to me is terrifying. I think that it's really important for people to be able to say what they think, and you may disagree 100% with it, but there has to be room for a discussion, because otherwise you can't come to a reasonable conclusion without hearing both sides of the story. And regardless of what you think is morally correct, you may have a completely different moral background, but that doesn't mean that the other person doesn't have the right to say or explain what he or she is thinking.
Yeah, and there's like with corporations, there's like a weird tension, because on the one hand, you're like, hey, a corporation is a group of people. So if you take a political position on something, corporation, you are inherently biasing towards some percentage of your employees and not others. But then on the other hand, you don't want to make it so corporations can't put in their position on something, because somebody like Fred Perlak, who invented or helped be a part of the team to invent BT, cotton, which saved all sorts of lives and limited the amount of pesticides. So I don't know how you balance these two things, because to me, it seems like I really don't want the power of corporations to be able to have their voice so outweigh other people. But on the other hand, they have to be a part of the conversation, because if you limit them out of it, then the only people that are talking are the activists or the end line consumers or something.
Yep, and I think that's a really difficult balance for corporations to walk, because they're always accused of one thing or the other, right? Having conflicts of interest and a whole variety of things. So I think that it's important, though, for corporations to do what they do best, which is make a product that people want. As long and the regulatory apparatus around them are supposed to keep them in that lane in terms of safety and things like that. So we have built in ways for corporations to behave. Now, I'm not going to say that all corporations have always, behaved honorably. Obviously not. But I think that we do have. At the moment, we've got one of the best regulatory systems in the world and the safest food supply in the world. And, and it's because of that balance that people have tried to keep over the past couple of decades. I'm afraid that that's at risk of going away. And then you get corporations actually having to sort of, take a moral tone, as opposed to have a regulatory body, have the corporation do what its job is to do, make a product that people want, a regulatory apparatus that governs that to make sure that those products are safe. And then the consumer, it's the best of both worlds. The consumer gets the best product out there, and people there's a safety mechanism built into that. What we've got now is we've got regulation by litigation and regulation. So you've got somebody who says, I've got this one paper that shows that this might be a problem, and that gets in front of a jury, and then everybody that gets kind of misinformation can get spread everywhere. Or regulation by legislation, where somebody comes to a legislator and says, I've read this paper, it concerns me. And then, you've got a huge imbalance between what is important and the regulatory apparatus that's designed by thousands of scientists looking at thousands of papers to make sure the products on the market are safe.
When I was working for Monsanto, and there would be activists that would show up, right? So I would sometimes get, not really yelled at, but definitely like some high tension, you're representing, this awful corporation. One of the things that I would always point out to them is, as an activist, you really ought to be careful, because in some ways, what you're doing by hammering on the table saying, we need more regulation to protect us from these evil corporations, you are actually helping the largest of corporations to dominate, because the corporations will say, oh, do you want us to take on another maybe 2-3 years of regulation? Just add on $1 million a year. That's fine, because all you're doing is making a moat that gets larger and larger. So if you want to have a startup, you have to have $13 million just to get in the door for the regulations. And so you can't. And so anytime you get a new technology, the only thing you can do is sell it to the people that have already figured out the regulatory apparatus.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So yeah, so small business owners have a really hard time, or academics have a very hard time, making that leap. So you've got very interesting products that are stuck on a shelf in a lab because universities are not equipped to take on that regulatory mechanism. So for a pesticide, it costs about $250 million and 10 years of research on safety and safety testing.
$250 million just on safety research.
Yeah.
Okay.
To get to the market, to put together the whole dossier for it to be approved to get on the market. So an incredible amount of testing goes into every pesticide that's been on the market. And in fact, that's why you tend to find not such a huge pipeline of pesticides. Most pesticides are, 20, 30, 40 years old. And because of the amount of safety studies that you have to do to get it on the market. Same thing with pharmaceuticals. I mean, I think pharmaceutical testing is closer to $1 billion to get it on the market. And they all are undergoing testing that is called good laboratory practice, or GLP studies, where they do a battery of safety studies that are designed by the regulatory agencies, that are monitored by the regulatory agencies. They can go into your lab and make sure you're following all the rules. If you have an adverse effect that is reportable by law to the regulatory agency. So a mouse dies, that gets reported to the EPA here. A mouse gets wobbly, that gets reported to the EPA. Somebody drinks your pesticide after it's on the market, that gets reported to the EPA. So it's a very, very... The reason why it's so strict is because you want to make sure that what your studies show are reproducible over and over and over and over again. And academic labs aren't set up to do that. They're set up to explore new ideas and exciting ideas for treating diseases or things like that. But they don't have that kind of capital to invest in the regulations that they actually are demanding, which is reasonable. It's reasonable to make sure that there are solid regulations around a product.
I mean, it's a weird thing because you want to find a way to be able to let the disruptors in, and you also don't. It's very easy to undervalue the fact that we have safe food. I was living in Kenya when they had an aflatoxin scare, and this is before we had ready access to the internet, so you could go to the post office, and for $10 a minute or something insane, you could go get a page of news or whatever. So I remember being there and having the Peace Corps volunteers pool our money together to buy some internet time to be able to look up how scared should we be of aflatoxin. And that was the first time in my life that I was ever looking at food and being it's just a couple of micrograms will kill you. You'll be dead. I've since come to find out it's a little bit more complicated than that. But I remember being absolutely terrified. And if you've never had that experience, you don't know. Would I rather be hungry or would I rather roll the dice? And eventually you roll the dice and it's scary.
It is scary. And so once again, that actually brings us right back to pesticides, right? So fungal infections of crops are hugely important. So fungal infections in people don't tend to be that bad unless you're immunosuppressed, right? But in crops, many fungi, which are carried by insects, and when insects eat the crop, they introduce these fungal infections from spores on their coats. They secrete carcinogenic mycotoxins. So aflatoxin is one of the big things that's regulated. So you actually need either insecticides or fungicides to prevent that, because it's not just one person being exposed, it's a huge swath of the population being exposed. So that's why these things are really, really important. One of the fungal infections in crops that I really like to talk about is Claviceps purpura ergot, which caused massive outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire in the Middle Ages, which was a disease where people's blood vessels would constrict, and their hands and feet and noses would fall off, and a whole variety of things. They'd have convulsions and hallucinations and all of this stuff. It's really, really horrible disease. Well, they figured out that ergot in rye was responsible for that, and it would grow in certain circumstances, but it would get into the food supply, and you'd have these big outbreaks. Ergot also turns out to be very useful for preventing postpartum hemorrhage, and was they discovered that a medicine called methyl organamine from that. And it turns out to be natural LSD. And that's where Albert Hoffman, he was looking at ergot when he discovered LSD. So LSD is a synthetic version of it, but lysergic acid is the natural version. So if you prefer to have LSD residues in your cereal, then,
So let's talk about this. Funny, because now we have a toxicologist here. It seems to me that psychotropics like LSD and shrooms and they're like really gaining public excitement or traction or whatever you want to call that. As a toxicologist, what do you think? Is this a dangerous game people are playing here?
So I think it's actually kind of interesting. And the reason why I think it's interesting is because what those chemistries do, they're called tryptamines. And tryptamines are very similarly shaped, structured as serotonin. And when you think about major depressive disorder and things like that, the thought is that you're not having enough serotonin floating around. And so if you enhance the amount of serotonin floating around, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, things like that, that actually improves mood. So they did a study, and several natural products produce tryptamine. So ayahuasca, which is you find in South America, which is a combination of a vine and a leaf, it has two kind of antidepressant-like chemistries in there that people will trip for 3 days in South America, but then they come back and they, after having refractory depression, have said that this has just revolutionized their lives. They've got, magic mushrooms. Johns Hopkins did a study in terminally ill cancer patients and gave them magic mushrooms, and the people who were in the group that got them said that it really relieved major depression. They weren't terrified of dying anymore. A whole variety of things. So they are promising, and biochemically it makes sense as to why they would work.
It's interesting because we talk about things like nicotine being in things like tobacco or caffeine being in coffee beans, and those being it just so happens that these have this stimulating effect. But nobody sits there and thinks, oh, this is like the human-plant connection. And yet people do with things like ayahuasca or magic mushrooms. Like they genuinely believe that there's some sort of circular path. What is your take on this? Is this something that just happens to be a mistake of nature, or is there some sort of feedback loop that made these better and better and better?
That's a really good question, and it probably goes, back to sort of indigenous medicine kind of stuff, where the medicine man would have a solution to something. And it's funny, I want to make a caveat out of this because there's a lot of alternative medicine kind of bunk out there where people are capitalizing on other people's, diseases. But a lot of medicine comes from plants, and a lot of people over centuries developed, traditional medicinal products to help with diseases. So, for example, there's a Walter, what was his last name? Melody, and I can't remember his last name. They were plant specialists, and they went down to South America, and they were with a tribe, and the women and men were separated, and the men were saying, for postpartum hemorrhage, this is a really good plant, and this is how you prepare it. And the women are sitting outside of the tent and going, no, that's not how you prepare it. They don't know what they're talking about. But what it turned out was that there was an actual fungus growing on the plant that was a commensal with the plant that had ergot-like properties, and so it caused vasoconstriction to the uterus. So a lot of medicinal chemistry comes from that kind of thing.
Meaning like people trying things out, not really knowing. I mean, that is the thing that's like the wildest to really think about. Like you have all these plants out there,
Mm-hmm.
You're in the desert and there's virtually no plants. How is it that you figure out that the juice of that cactus boiled in just the right way under these specific conditions make this thing happen? I mean, it must have been absurd amounts of trial and error.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, and then there are also absurd amounts of absolutely no benefit, but that get sold and packaged as this will fix the common cold, or this will, cure COVID or whatever. They've got all sorts of, alternative medicine products out there that are snake oil. So snake oil salesmen are still there.
Yeah. I mean, and have been since the dawn of time, because you don't really know. Another big movement that's going on, and be interested to hear a toxicologist's opinion on, is I know several men that are now taking doses of testosterone. And so, if you think about life being broken into the pre-reproductive, the reproductive, and then the post-reproductive phase, it seems like taking T allows you to push out the amount of time that you can spend in that reproductive phase. Are there downsides to guys that want to get bulked up taking testosterone, or is this a magical cure?
Anabolic steroids you got to be careful with, just in general. Too much of anything.
Is that the same thing, testosterone and anabolic steroids?
It's a steroid. Yeah, it's an anabolic steroid. Yeah.
So I don't. So give this to me, from the beginning, because I'm lost here.
So steroid hormones are a group of them are like sex steroids, sex hormones, and depending on the relative concentration of one versus the other, or there's more than one, but you will have more masculine features or more feminine features. They've been traditionally banned in sports because they can enhance, strength and endurance and things like that. But it's not just that. It's not just that's the problem. You can have things like something called hepatic paleosis, where your liver becomes, the blood vessels in your liver become sort of dilated, and you get a big sort of pocket of blood that can, if it ruptures, you can have fatal hemorrhage. There are a whole variety of things that can really be problematic from a health perspective if you're taking too much. People tend to think, oh, if I take a little bit, then a lot should be much better. So now there are some reasons to take steroids. And so I think that if you are under supervision of a physician who specializes in, endocrine kind of things, then I think that you're probably okay to do that. But if you're just doing it, if you think you're buying it from somebody, for example, I've got a great story. If you think you're buying it from some random person and that you're getting testosterone, you don't know what you're getting. For example, I had a patient that came into the ER with a blood sugar of 12. His wife found him comatose. And
is that a lot or a little?
That's very low. That's very low. You want to be above 60, right? Okay. So that's life threatening. He would have died if his wife didn't find him. And he had bought what he thought was veterinary grade oxandrolone, which is a testosterone-like compound, right? So he could get bulked up. And what it turned out was he bought pure, what we call glyburide, which is an anti-diabetic agent that makes your blood sugar go, right? And it was pure. I mean, there was not a drop of oxandrolone in there. So buying this stuff, you never know what you're getting. Right. So if you're getting a prescription from a physician who is supervising, numbers and things like that, then that's probably a much more reliable way to go than it is to just buy it at the gym.
It seems to me like there are a lot of people going to doctors for this. And you look at, say, somebody like Jeff Bezos or, any movie star, or I think there are just a lot of people out there doing this to extend life. Do you think, in a way, like a fountain of youth? You don't get away with it? I don't think,
we're all dead in the long run. So, I mean, it's the same. I think everybody's looking for a fountain of youth. That's why Botox is so popular. That's why, these steroids are so popular and things like that. If you eat just this, or drink just that, so there's always people wanting a prescription for how to live longer. Well, I think it's a miracle that since the 20th century, have had a 30-year increase in life expectancy with 5 very basic public health interventions. So water sanitation, vaccines, antibiotics, food security, and vector control. That bought us 30 years increased life expectancy. In 1900, life expectancy was 45 years old. So now we're trying to push the edge. And everybody's like, oh, there's an epidemic of all these chronic diseases, heart disease, cancer, and this, that, and the other. Well, that's because you survived past the ripe old age of 25 because of one of those 5 interventions. And
Wow, that is actually a really interesting way to do that. It's almost like controlling for inflation in some sort of a calculation. Like, how is it that you make people not freak out about, heart disease or these other diseases of age when you're saying, hey, you already got your 30 extra years and you're going to go out somehow.
That's exactly right. But I'm watching the systematic dismantling of it, right? So everybody's focused on their microbiome. So they're drinking raw water. Well, that's how you get cholera, right? Or they want to get rid of pasteurization. Well, that's how you get E. coli infections and listeria. They want to get rid of, vaccines. Well, that's how you get, measles and COVID and, all sorts of things like that. They're talking about, getting rid of pesticides. Well, that's how malaria makes a comeback. Typhus makes a comeback. The plague makes a comeback. You really have to think about these things. Food security, everybody here takes for granted. But like we said in Kenya, it's a real big deal. So, yes, I think that it's nice to be able to, have products that help us look a little bit better, feel more confident or whatever. But those have side effects too. But those aren't going to do anything like the basics that we did in the 20th century do.
So, you were a medical doctor, you were practicing all the time, and then you told me before the show got started, like the electronic medical records made it so I had no interest in moving forward.
That's exactly
Talk a little
right.
bit about that. I don't think people have any idea how much the electronic medical records have messed with medicine.
Oh my gosh, yeah, they've been terrible. So they were sold. Well, first of all, to preface this, I had never imagined myself not practicing medicine. I loved taking care of patients. I loved with the doctors that I worked with. I loved just the brain power that was there. I learned so much from them, and it was a real privilege to be a doctor. Real privilege. That said, I've watched a bureaucratic apparatus build up that has gotten in the way and capitalized on the doctor-patient-nurse interaction. And it's become increasingly impossible to deliver quality care in an enormously wealthy country because of all of the things that surround being a doctor. And one of the major things is the electronic medical record. So the electronic medical record was sold as this is going to be a great way for doctors to be able to communicate with each other. You won't have to be trying to find paper records. It's important for patient safety. So you get, if you have an unconscious patient, you can easily look up their record and find out what this is, or, what's been going on with them and help your differential diagnosis. It's also good because doctors have lousy handwriting, and so they'll be able to print up prescriptions and you won't make pharmaceutical mistakes that way. What it actually turned into is a big billing document for hospitals. So the doctors, infectious disease doctors at the moment are now spending 24 extra hours per week documenting in order to be able to get paid. It also made it so that individual practices could not afford to stay as individual practices. So the High Tech Act, which I think happened in 2010, where it was mandated that everybody move to electronic medical records. So private practices where you could do pro bono work, you could see your patient, and and if the patient couldn't afford it, you could let them walk out the door. Well, they couldn't maintain all the bureaucracy, and out of the box, the electronic medical record cost at least $50,000. And then you had to do security updates and, comply with HIPAA. And not only that, you had your whole back office that you had to, which is a separate thing. The back office that you're paying for is trying to negotiate with insurance companies to pay for what you think the patient needs. So the red tape just got to be extraordinary. And so I know a doctor who started an electronic medical record in his office, and he took home $48,000 one year. So if you are just out of a medical school, residents now at the moment have about $250,000, $300,000 worth of debt to medical school. And they're doing an apprenticeship during their residency, so they're not able to really make a big dent in those loans. So here they are finishing at around 35, 40 years old with this huge set of loans, and then they've got this huge bureaucratic apparatus. So they don't have $50,000 to drop on a electronic medical record, and then all of the money it takes to make sure that the security and patient privacy and all of that stuff is kept up. So they become employees of the hospital. And the hospital takes over all of that. And then the hospital is telling them what they can and cannot do. And the hospital has become this, once again, I mean, you've seen how big the hospitals are around here. They've gone from sort of one-stop
They're a
shops.
major driver of a city's economy in a way that is like bizarre, right? Like it's not just like, oh, we have a hospital complex and therefore we have a few doctors that live in this area. No, they build these hospitals to be huge because they want to put them all under one house, and then we'll pay, per license for these electronic medical records. And like one of my favorite, so I have these things, I call them cashier questions, which are like, what's something that you can ask a person based on their everyday life? And whenever I'm in a doctor's office, I always ask the nurses, what do you think of your electronic medical records thing? Like, how do you like that? And without fail, they'll talk about like, I have arthritis now because of the number of clicks that I have to do. They're talking about like 10,000 clicks a week that you're doing on your mouse. They talk about like the way that things became so siphoned down to just like certain words, certain descriptions of the way a diagnosis would be or what the treatment would be, that it's become like a Mad Lib for medical treatment instead of using it as an art.
That's exactly right. The art of medicine is completely lost by that. So what it's become is, so when I was an intern, 3 pieces of paper would go up from the ER with a patient: the doctor's note, the nurse's note, and the cover sheet. When I got back as an attending for my fellowship, 56 pages of notes went up, and you couldn't figure out what happened in the ER. You could not find, it was, this lab was ordered, and it was over and over and over and over again. Or, a nurse would have to document normal exams every hour instead of do the exam and tell the doctor if there was something that changed. And so you lose really valuable information buried in this avalanche of paper, which it technically was supposed to save, right? So in terms of environmental impact, it's incredible. But the amount of documentation that has nothing to do with patient care, I think people in the AI world think that the art of medicine is not valuable. But one of the things that you're trained in, for example, I had a kid, my very last patient was a kid who I was called to see for a brown recluse spider bite, which can look like a little necrotic area and can cause problems in kids and things like that. And the kid was really uncomfortable. And I put my hand on his shoulder, and he just started wailing. And it just agony, intense pain. Brown recluse spider bites are very uncomfortable, but they do not do that. And it's only because I have seen multiple patients with brown recluse spider bites. And I was like, that kid needs imaging right now because I think he's got necrotizing fasciitis, which is a limb-threatening thing, or death, right, if you miss that. And it's just because I touched his shoulder. And I was right. And he had to go to the OR and get antibiotics and get it debrided and stuff like that. So a computer is not going to be able to do that. And it's not because I've got some special wizardry. It's because I've seen this so many times before. And that's what's so important. That's what people are losing sight of when it comes to medical care. They think it all should be protocolized, but different people have different problems. And
I had a doctor. I went in and, he was looking at like a skin thing that I had. And he looked at me for like just a couple of seconds, kind of looked at it. And then the rest of the time, instead of looking and talking at me, he's sitting there going through, he's got an iPad and he's apologizing the whole time he's doing it. But we have no interaction, right? And I think like how much of medicine in particular, like I'm an outgoing person. I'm not embarrassed. I've had enough medical problems that I can get naked in front of a doctor.
Yeah.
It's no problem. But there are a lot of people that can't.
No.
Right? And if you don't have that eye contact time
Nope.
with a doctor to where you're like, hey, this person's listening to me, they understand me, then when the time comes for you to bring something up with them,
You're not going to.
Yeah, and you might walk out of there being like, that doctor's a jerk. He doesn't care about me. You know, they don't. So I'm going to go to this alternative practitioner where they're not doing electronic medical records, so they can sit there and give you 30, 45 minutes, an hour of time, and they get to give you all of that.
And they get paid for it.
Right.
So the doctor's got 7 minutes per patient, and people are like, they did this thing. They had something called the Press-Ganey score, where patients got to rank you on whether or not they liked you, and your reimbursement was associated with that. Well, when you are trying to fulfill all these different things, especially if you have a bunch of really sick people all at once, right? You're never going to be able to live up to that kind of score. And so now you've got the kind of worst of all worlds. You've got a doctor who's basically doing data entry, has become a data entry clerk, and a very expensive data entry clerk, and a very expensive data entry clerk who is in a huge amount of debt and cannot afford to lose their jobs. So they're chained to these big hospital systems now.
I will say, though, that the doctors did their own part in slitting their own throats here, because one of the things people don't realize is there are more applicants that are qualified to get into medical school by far than we let into medical school. You could start new medical schools, although the licensing that you want to do, the people that determine whether you have the blessing to be an MD don't want that. So they're trying to control the supply.
So I would tell you, though, that even though they're trying to control the supply at that end, the Clintons made a deal in 1997 where they capped the number of residencies. So residencies are paid for by Medicare. So taxpayer dollars. For the hospitals get paid $150,000 on average per resident, and they give the resident about $50,000 a year on average. Medicare decided that there were going to be too many doctors. And so so you do have a supply of medical students who can't get a job as a resident because of that regulatory thing that happened. If having started a fellowship, I had to find the funding for that fellowship, right? And so you get a cap. You can't keep on having more and more and more residents because they won't pay the hospital for those residents.
So part of a residency is you finish all of your medical school and then you go do a residency, which is essentially an apprenticeship, right?
Yep.
And then, so you're saying the government said, we have a limit on the number of apprenticeships that we're going to pay for. Then why doesn't the private sector pop in to solve this?
Because I think that's a good question. I think that it's really actually that the hospitals kind of have a corner on the market. You have to in order to get board certified, you have to go through a certain kind of residency. There are some emergency medicine programs that are run by venture capital, people and stuff like that. But that is a different dynamic because the bottom line is what matters, right? As opposed to learning how to take care of patients. So a lot of residents want to be in an academic program where they're actually learning how to take care of patients the best way possible. Now, I'll argue that now that they're spending all their time with their backs turned to patients and typing into the computer, so, that's gone away, that you're actually impacting resident learning as well. But there are enough medical, I think if you were able to let these medical students into these residencies are fairly competitive, some of them. And so if you were able to open it up so more medical students who have finished medical school, there's whole organizations for those kinds of medical students that are not able to get a job.
It's a weird thing, right? Like, we have the potential to have so much good medical care, and yet we've really integrated the making of money and government and supply and demand. Like, it is a very, very complicated thing. Do you foresee the American medical system staying at the top of the world?
No. absolutely not. No, I think, and I don't think it's been at the top of the world.
Oh,
for a
tell me
long
more
time.
about that.
I think that it's got potential. If you make a lot of money and you can afford, I'm not even going to ratchet that back a little bit. If I were to get sick anywhere, there are two places that I would go. One of them is Ireland, and one of them is France. France has the best medical system in the world. And Ireland's got the lowest maternal mortality rate in the world. They're just stellar medical systems. And it's stellar teaching, and very, very affordable. But the problem is the population in those two countries is much smaller than the population of the United States. So when we talk about comparing medical systems, you often hear about, Scandinavia or France or things like that, as opposed to, with a couple million people. France, I guess, I don't know how many people live in France, 80 million or something like that. But that's vastly different than 330 million, right? So I think if you were to compare the United States to the EU's outcome, you would get something that was a little bit more on par. But I think that although the United States has great research and has a lot of innovation that other countries don't necessarily have, I think that the medical training has really gone downhill. For example, they've taken pharmacology and taken it from a year and have squashed it down into 6 weeks. And the notion is that when you're rotating on the wards in your different specialties, you'll learn the pharmacology from the attendings that are teaching it. Well, if you don't rotate on a cardiology floor, you're not going to know anything about cardiac pharmacology. So other than the little 6 weeks you've got there. And as that gets perpetuated, your attendings as they get out are not going to know anything about that pharmacology either. So you're not going to be learning this stuff. So they've really taken some of the rigor out of medical school, and I think it's going to impact patients in the long run. And we have a tidal wave of baby boomers coming. It's 76 million people, and the medical system in this country this is not sustainable. I don't know how else to describe it.
And so how does it play out? Do you get to 3 mothers to a bed where one has to get on the floor when...
I hope not. I hope not. I really don't. That's a catastrophe. That's a catastrophe. I think that it is, I think, the most complicated mess that's out there for there's been a relatively steady supply of doctors, and there's been an exorbitant increase in the number of administrators. And with everybody keeps on thinking that the government's going to do something better. Every government intervention has made medicine exorbitantly more expensive. And so I don't necessarily think that, a one payer system, and I think a lot of doctors would disagree with this, but doctors don't understand how some of this, the financing of all of this works. And that for hospitals, it's a business. And so those are conflicting.
Well, I have a buddy, the YouTuber, Chubby Emu.
Oh, yeah.
So he's a medical doctor, and he talks about, in Chinese culture, they have a very strong sense that medicine is represented by the tree, and money is represented by iron. And those two don't mix because iron always cuts the tree down. And this is very, you need to be very, very careful about making medicine into a money-making enterprise because it will always destroy the medicine. It's stronger in that way, and medicine takes a long time to grow. And I think that's a very interesting metaphor. And I also studied under a Chinese professor when I was in graduate school, and he talked about out in the countryside, the way that doctors work. They weren't referred to as doctors in the same way that we do with this Western concept. It was basically you paid them unless you were sick. And if you got sick, then you didn't pay the doctor.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So they only got paid when everybody was healthy. And so you were on this health model. And then at end of care, the doctor wasn't making more money as he kept grandma alive for too long. He would help along the process and keep her healthy when he could. And so I think that these are very easy to say in theory. I don't know how you apply it to a modern economy of 330 million people, but it does seem to me that we've somehow gotten pretty far off the tracks, and we're going to pay for it to the extent that we might actually lose the social technology of medicine.
Yeah, and it's worrisome. I mean, I think it starts all the way out with at the beginning with education. It's the college is extraordinarily expensive. It increases at 8% per year, the tuition, and then you've got medical school on top of it, and then you've got somebody who's very heavily in debt, trying to then spend the next 3 or 4 years of their lives making enough money to get by, and then that cycle starts over again because they have kids, and they want to put their kids through school and stuff like that. So it starts with the educational process and then ends with this, a whole bunch of interested parties capitalizing on. So, for example, to be board certified, it used to be that you would take an exam and then you would keep up with your CME. Now you've got to take an exam, or in some boards, take an exam every 10 years. That costs $2,500. You have to pay the board yearly for mini exams and extra for CME. You have to pay them more and more and more money. Then you like merit badges, so ACLS, BLS, PALS, all of the resuscitation things, right? So ATLS you do every 4 years, and that's $500. ACLS for the cardiac life support you do every 2 years. That's about $500. And then you have to do basic life support. If I'm doing CPR in the ER every day, I need to be trained again. Right. So it's a time, and they're all making money off this. And if you don't fulfill these requirements, the hospital won't let you practice. And so the American Board of Internal Medicine is being sued right now because they've had, a huge amount of money come into them, that off the backs of doctors, and they apparently had, I don't know, they've had a nice fancy condo, that they've got cars that they drive around, they've got nice vacations that the board gets to go on and stuff like that. So doctors have been so busy working and trying to get things done that they've kept their heads down, and this has just happened around them. Now they're the most expensive people in the hospitals, and so what they're doing is the hospitals are hiring nurse practitioners with nowhere near the same kind of requirements for maintaining certification instead of doctors. So and the nurse practitioners are lobbying to have independent practice. And I can understand why there's a shortage of doctors, but they also don't have the same qualifications as doctors, and they want to do it independently. They don't want to be supervised by doctors, and so there's a whole sort of tribe. There are tribes there. There are people who are like, that's maybe not such a good idea, and they're the doctors that say that. People are like, how dare you say that? Well,
It seems to me like it is such a complicated problem that by the time any person actually understood the problem, it would be far too long. Like wherever you started, it's going to take you years. I have, and there's not going to be any quick, easy solutions. But so to me, yeah, there's. I'm a big fan of the move towards the concierge type medicine, right, where you pay a doctor every month. And it's closer to that Chinese way of doing it. And I think it's the same thing for physical therapy. I think it's the same thing for a dentist, right? Like find a place where you're paying them just to be there. And then when you need help, they aren't overtaxed. They can see you.
That's exactly right. But that doesn't take away the thing that's the sort of elephant in the room. If you get sick and you go to the hospital, you are in a huge amount of debt. So you need insurance for that. So that doesn't, I think it's much better for the patients to have that model, but in terms of the doctor-patient relationship, but it doesn't fix the hospital problem. It doesn't fix the testing problem and things like that. So for example,
yeah, we hadn't even talked about insurance. I mean, insurance is insane, right? Like it's, I could get catastrophic care and then get there and then be like, that's not really a catastrophe. So that's exactly not really covered.
That's exactly right. So I took my son to the hospital for a migraine, and I knew it was a migraine. I needed a doctor's note, and the only reason why I took him to the hospital was because it was 11 o'clock at night and his high school entrance exam was the next morning. The bill, I got no medicine. I knew the doctor, and this is so it's not the doctor's fault. I knew everybody at the hospital, right? I need a doctor's note. I couldn't write it. The pediatrician hasn't seen him. They won't write it. Urgent care is closed. $1,500 for a doctor's note, $500 of which the insurance company paid. Close, almost $1,000 out of pocket for an ER visit that got no intervention. And I wouldn't have taken him to the ER if he hadn't had that exam the next morning. If he hadn't had an exam the next morning. So I'm lucky because I can afford that. But if that's something that I stress out about, I imagine that ordinary everyday people who don't have the cushion, that's devastating for them. It's devastating for them. That cost is untenable.
Yeah, and anything that's going to keep people in jobs they don't want to be in, but because their healthcare is tied to it, only stops innovation, right? It stops all of the new ideas that people could have. It continues to separate people from the haves from the have-nots, because if you can enslave people because they had to take their son in to get it's a crazy thing. Well, let's end on a more positive note.
Sure.
Talk about something you've been excited about, something that you've seen on the horizon that you're like, this is a good thing and more people should know about this.
The end of COVID is on the horizon in terms of these vaccines. These vaccines are the coolest technology out there. And I think that the mRNA technology has the potential to revolutionize medicine in the same way penicillin did. I think it's that good. And I don't say that very easily about a lot of different kind of newfangled things, but this has got real potential. There was a report the other day that came out that they were able to give an injection of a similar kind of mRNA. It wasn't for COVID, but it was to this man had something called amyloidosis, which is a lethal problem, and he inherited it. They were able to reverse it with this technology because the mRNA can seek out that abnormal protein and make sure it doesn't get made, is essentially what it is. The protein builds up in cells, and then because it builds up in cells, you wind up having cell death. And if you get enough cell death, you wind up having a huge problem. So I think it's got potential to revolutionize treatment of cancer. It's helped people in early trials with sickle cell anemia. I think it's got really...
So you work in the regulatory world. The speed with which this thing got, put together really fast, right?
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
So there's a lot of mythology about that. So normally with vaccines, you have to have enough people to participate in the study, and enough people with the disease to participate in the study. So the shortest vaccine time ever, I believe, was mumps, right? And people, I think it took 4 years, right? And that's just because you don't see a lot of mumps. COVID was so widespread that you were able to recruit 70,000 people within a couple of months to do that. So I would actually argue that despite the speed of it, this is the most robust vaccine study, the Pfizer and Moderna, and the ongoing other ones too. But the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are the most robust vaccine studies out there. And they're just, you had enough people, you had very marked decrease in significant illness, very marked decrease in ICU stays. And so the speed doesn't bother me. I think that, there were some questions about Operation Warp Speed. And once again, a lot of that got politicized because of, the Trump administration promoting it. But I think that even skeptics have started to come around and say, wow, no, this is actually really, really important science.
When I look out in the world, and I'm in a group of very intelligent people, and they're in ag, and they started shipping around articles about, sterility that happened with other mRNA in animals, and people being like, how is it that if you can't say for certain that this doesn't happen, that you would start pushing people as though this, it should be mandatory, or so that people should have to do this to be able to participate? And I watched the scientific community see this and start pushing back, and they treated those people like they're dumb.
They're not dumb.
They're not dumb.
They're
and
not
I
dumb.
think it's a huge mistake to be doing this, and to even roll your eyes that
That's
somebody
exactly
doesn't
right.
want the vaccine. Fuck off.
Yeah.
If they don't want that vaccine, they don't have to take it.
I think that that is another issue that, once again, people have gotten. That's gotten so politicized, and people roll their eyes, and people say that so where science fell down there was they assume that you don't have any reason for disagreeing. They think that your reasons are not legitimate, and if you were only as smart as they were, you would see the light. As opposed to understand what happened was, once again, there were discussions in the scientific community about product safety, right? Just like there are discussions in between the pipeline people and the regulatory people in companies about product safety. This was the first time those discussions were public. And so they raised doubt in the general population's mind, because they wanted to make sure that there wasn't a question about sterility. And the sterility thing there've been plenty of women who've had babies, have been pregnant and gotten the vaccine and had babies and no miscarriages and things like that. But the sterility thing is something that people worried about. And instead of going, I understand that you're worried about that, it's just like, you're dumb. And if you could...
Kevin Folta, good friend of mine, God bless him, I love him, but he sat on my podcast and said, well, there was the noble lie about the masks. And he said, we needed those masks, and people had them, and we wanted them, and science said that this is the noble lie. Man, people will never trust you again.
That's exactly right. And the other thing that happened was that the hydroxychloroquine discussion got completely polarized to the point where the Lancet published a fraudulent article written by a group called Surgisphere, and the people that made up Surgisphere were I think he was a cardiologist, a science fiction writer, and somebody who is involved in I guess alternative lifestyle. I think she was a adult film, I don't know, something like this. But not exactly, your scientific types. And they said that they had found 96,000 people who had been all around the world that had been, had trials with hydroxychloroquine or a control arm. And then when people said, and they rushed to publish this because, I think that they were politicized, and it turned out to be fraudulent. And then they had to retract the article. Well, that's a top-tier medical journal. And so when people see top-tier medical journals publishing fraudulent articles and then defending them, very much like the same journal published it started the anti-vax movement. The Lancet published Andrew Wakefield's article and essentially stood by it for 12 years. And that gave us the anti-vaccine movement. So,
I think in a world where it used to be that the speed with which we could have disagreements allowed things to anneal and to change people's minds over time.
You had a cooling off period.
Yeah, and now it's so fast and it's so hot and it's so public that people end up supporting the movement as opposed to the idea. So as we're finishing with this, give me the what's on the horizon with mRNA. Like why are you so excited about this?
I really think that it has unbelievable therapeutic potential for example, to very specifically target abnormal proteins in different kinds of cancers that you can tailor it to, and you can kill cancer that way, and without huge toxic doses of chemotherapeutic drugs. Now, I don't know what research is on the horizon that way, but this is just the technology has the potential to do that. I think it's mind blowing, and I think it's just unbelievable technology.
Well, that kind of passion is what will get people to pay attention instead of the arguing that people should be doing it. So I'm glad you're out there, and yeah, maybe the next time you come on, we'll talk about where mRNA has gotten there. Liza, we should have done this a long time ago. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. If people wanted to get in touch with you, learn more about your feelings on pesticides, or just kind of chat with you in general, how would they do that?
They can do it at Dr. Liza MD on Twitter. I have a LinkedIn page that I don't use that often. I don't check that often, but
Well, Liza, you have always been a very good friend of mine. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's been fun. It was great.